Welcome, everyone. We are really happy and honored to co-host this panel today, along with our partners, PEN America, and the high-level panel in the context of World Press Freedom Day to discuss the crucial topic of media freedom in the face of blasphemy laws. We are particularly thrilled to have Karuna Nundi back here at Columbia with us. She's produced this report, which is going to be presented today, and the report is the result of close collaboration with leading academic institutions around the world, and it examines national laws relating speech labeled blasphemous to assess the compatibility of these laws with international standards. Karuna is a worldwide expert on freedom of expression, and she's also an expert affiliated with Global Freedom of Expression, and she's also been on the jury of our annual awards. She deserves all our gratitude. She is also an advocate before the Supreme Court of India and a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. Welcome, Karuna, and thank you for being here to share this important work and research. Moreover, it is a great privilege to have with us Susan Nossel, CEO of PEN America, for also co-hosting today's event and for contributing her expert insights on this issue. We are pleased and grateful to have you. Welcome also Baroness Helena Kennedy, Director of the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute. It is also an honor to have with us today other distinguished members of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, the independent advisory body of the Media Freedom Coalition. And particular welcome also to Professor John Yegansu and Hina Jalani, advocate before the Supreme Court of Pakistan. The work that the high-level panel does, providing advice and recommendations to governments and international organizations, is of great importance to prevent and reverse abuses of media freedom around the world. As part of that key work that the high-level panel does, we are gathered today to discuss media freedom in the context of blasphemy laws, a pressing issue in this turbulent world, not only for journalists and media professionals, but also for all people who value the fundamental human right of freedom of expression. Blasphemy laws not only violate religious freedom, but have also been used to silence and punish critical voices and restrict freedom of expression and opinion. Writers, political opponents, and journalists who report on controversial, complex, and sensitive issues often risk being labeled blasphemers and suffer imprisonment, harassment, threats, punishment, and violations of their human rights. So at this point, it is my great pleasure to turn the floor to Professor John Yegansu, leading barrister and counsel in freedom of expression and journalistic protection cases, both in the United Kingdom and internationally. Professor Yegansu is also a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, as well as a senior fellow at the law school's Human Rights Institute. So welcome, Professor Yegansu.
Willie, thank you very much indeed. I'm juggling many hats today, but the hat I'm wearing at the moment is as the deputy chair of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. And on behalf of the panel, I'd just like to express our gratitude, but also how happy we are that we're teaming up with PEN America and Columbia Global Freedom of Expression on World Press Freedom Day to unveil this important report. Now, the reality is that the links between Columbia Global Freedom of Expression and the high-level panel are many, and they run deep. Karuna Nundi and I were reminiscing just last night how actually it was Columbia Global Freedom of Expression that marked the occasion of our meeting in 2015, when we were both invited by President Bollinger and Agnes Kalamar to the annual conference. And you will notice that we were then appointed experts into that institution, and you will also notice that a significant number of the members of the high-level panel also serve as experts for global freedom of expression. And that's not where the links end, because when the panel started its work in 2019, I think it's fair to say that Columbia Global Freedom of Expression has been a trusted and invaluable partner to support the panel's work. I also want to take this opportunity to draw attention to some of the links with PEN America, PEN International, and English PEN. I have the privilege of serving as a trustee of English PEN. I have the privilege of having served as counsel for PEN America, PEN International, and English PEN. But relevantly for today, all of the PENs have been extremely supportive of the panel's work, and in particular, the recommendations and the findings that the panel has made and presented to the state members of the Media Freedom Coalition. What I just want to do now, in just a few moments, is to put today's event, today's report, in the broader context of the work of the panel. So this Media Freedom Coalition that Hawley referred to was established in 2019. It's a coalition of states. It was co-chaired initially by Canada and the United Kingdom. Those two countries asked other states to come together and pledge to protect and promote media freedom. What they did was to create a structure really rests on three pillars. The first pillar is the states themselves. And now the Media Freedom Coalition is 50 or so states strong. The current co-chairs are the Netherlands and Canada, and Canada is going to be succeeded by Estonia very soon, if not already, as co-chair to the Media Freedom Coalition. That's the first pillar. Those are the states. But when the states got together to form this structure, they also convened a high-level panel of legal experts, media freedom. They asked Lord Neuberger of Abbotsbury, the chair of the panel, to appoint 15 experts, and he did that with the inaugural deputy chair of the high-level panel, Mr. Mark Clooney, also an expert of one of the experts at Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. And the remit of the panel is to advise the states on legal reform, to advise the states on legal mechanisms so as to protect and to promote media freedom. But the all-important third pillar is the consultative network. And this is the grouping of civil society organizations with whom both the panel and the states consult to take forward their work. Now, the panel has been asked to review draft legislation from states all over the world, including coalition states. It's been asked by regional human rights courts to make submissions in cases engaging media freedoms. But when it comes to our advisory work, we've produced 4 reports to date, which really try to identify how existing legal mechanisms can be strengthened and how new legal mechanisms can be established to protect and promote journalists in particular. And that work has focused on the issues of safe refuge for journalists at risk, more effective investigations following journalist attacks and killings, sanctions for those who will persecute journalists, and strengthening the international law on consular support for journalists who receive threats abroad. Happily, members of the Media Freedom Coalition, the states, have started to give effect to our recommendations as the panel. Now we're moving on to looking at international standards. And that brings me to today, because this absolutely excellent report that was authored by Karuna Nundi, its recommendations fully endorsed by the high-level panel of legal experts, is really the beginning of our work on international standards. I think I'd just like to say, aside from thanking Karuna, thanking also the civil society organizations and the universities that have put enormous amounts of work, as well as Karuna's team, into this report, and to the members of the high-level panel who've worked with Karuna to to bring it here. Of course, the issue is one of great importance. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Baroness Helena Kennedy to moderate the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone who's come to this launch of the report on blasphemy, which Karuna has drafted and where she's led a great deal of work. I want to start by just saying that you have an incredible panel here, and you've heard a brief outline of their great life's works, but I'm going to remind you about them again when it comes to their speaking. I should introduce myself. I am a lawyer who's practiced for, I blush when I say 50 years at the English bar. So I'm an old hand, and I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm at Doughty Street Chambers, but I also run the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. And the reports which we have been involved in creating from the high-level panel on media freedom have been a proud product of the work since I became the director, because there is no doubt that media freedom is fundamental to human rights. If we don't have people exposing the wrongs in our society, the ways in which people are abused, the corruptions at high level, if we don't have people speaking truth to power, then human rights are meaningless. And so without knowledge, people do not know what their rights might be and the ways in which they're being traduced. So it's vitally important to protect journalists as well as lawyers and judges within a democracy. Now, I wanted to just explain to you that I'm a King's Counsel. That's why there's a KC after my name. It does not mean that I represent the King. It doesn't even mean that I'm a prosecutor. It means that I am one of a cadre of sort of ancient lawyers within the system, senior lawyers within the system. One of my children, when he was a little boy of 8, someone asked him, what does it mean that your mummy is a Queen's Counsel, as I was then? And he said, if the Queen's arrested, my mummy will represent her. But the chance never came. Anyway, I'm now going to just give you a few thoughts to you before we introduce Karuna to you. Blasphemy is about insult to religion. That's how it's being perceived. And there are wider definitions, but that is at its core what we're talking about. And it's existed in most countries, particularly countries where they've had a very dominant religion, and it's to protect that as part of the identity of the nation. The UK, my own country, had blasphemy legislation until comparatively recently, in the 90s, that it was drawn to a close. And that came as a result of something that many of you will remember, which was the publication of Satanic Verses, a novel by Salman Rushdie. And it led to a great deal of dissent and argument over the whole business of blasphemy, because, of course, blasphemy in the United Kingdom only protected the established church. It protected Christianity and did not expand to protect Islam. And so there were arguments then, because there were demonstrations, there were the burning of books, there was the murder of people in the publishing world because of the publication of the Satanic Verses. And we've seen even recently the assault, the grievous assault on Salman Rushdie himself only a year or so ago. And so the Muslim community in Britain was very angry that there were no protections from, of insult to their religion. And so there was a great debate on whether blasphemy laws were appropriate. Should they be expanded to cover other religions, or should they in fact exist at all? And the argument was one that blasphemy laws had served their purpose and they were outdated and they were not appropriate and did not conform to international human rights law. I was brought up in Scotland as a person of Catholic background, Irish Catholic immigrants, and "fuck the Pope" was a memory written on most walls in my city, and I'm sure that my mother was deeply offended, but offence is not a good reason for criminalizing anything. And so the discourse on this is about what is needed in a free society, but how do you protect particularly minority communities from the kind of insult and abuse that they might receive by virtue of their identity as a minority. And we should make sure that we disentangle it to deal with that. I wanted just to mention something that's very important to us all. Article 17 of the International Convention on Human Rights protects not just freedom of religion. That's the thing that's always flagged up. It also protects freedom of thought. What happens in that forum internum. And protecting freedom of thought is really vitally important. It's the seat of our imagination, of creativity, of invention, of ideas, the things that advance humanity and create better societies. But of course, it's also the seat of a lot of nasty stuff too. But to start criminalizing thought would be a very, very dangerous way to go. And so that has to be borne in mind in any debate about blasphemy. And it should also be in the context of the ways in which societies change, particularly around issues of women's place in society, because so many religions, I would say probably most of them at their most fundamentalist and orthodox, are not terribly good on the women's question. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in this debate. It does not mean that speech should be without restriction, inciting to violence, to racial hatred, and the whole business of hate speech being accompanying acts of violence. It's when those thoughts are translated into actions that we should be most concerned. So I'm going to hand over to you now to our author of this really important report, Karen Nunde, who's worked on it very hard, making sure that she's taking account of the positions taken in different countries and the sensitivities involved, because religion can often be very dear to the identity of people, and yet at the same time being mindful of why it's so important that there is also this balance with freedom of thought. Over to you, Karuna.
Thank you all for coming. I am so glad to be finally helping this report and these ideas see light of day. And we're delighted that you could come. How many of you are lawyers? Okay, so that's about a third. I'll try and keep it less technical. We have gone into quite serious technicalities in this report for those who are interested. On religious freedom and discontent, who we are, what we think, our freedom of conscience is so deeply connected to some of our deepest values on the one hand, and those might contain aspects of religion or religion itself, and speech, how the two are connected. Where do we draw various lines? When do we say that speech is criminalized? When do we say thought? How much of this is criminalization of thought? And when do we say that speech that looks like blasphemy is actually hate speech and hasn't been addressed properly? This report goes into all of that, and it couldn't have happened if the National Law University of Delhi, my chambers, the Nandi chambers, and the high-level panel of media freedom, legal experts on media freedom, had not banded together to work on it over a long period, over many years, really. Who do we speak of when we speak of blasphemy? Mahsa Amini most of you will know that in September of last year, Mahsa Amini was arrested in Tehran, and Iran's morality police, tasked with detaining people to promote virtue, arrested her for wearing her hijab in an improper manner. She was wearing her hijab, but there were a few strands of hair coming out. Amini died 3 days into her detention due to what is widely alleged as severe beatings by law enforcement. This artwork, widely identified with the protests and the uprisings that came quite rightly after, is by Seher Gurishi. Was this limited to people who were performing acts and the Iran morality police was harassing or detaining? It actually implicates a huge number of journalists as well. So Niloufar Hamedi, second from left, is a well-known journalist. She received the Guillermo Award yesterday.
You want, do you want me to try to go to the next slide?
Yes,
There you
thank
go.
you. Will you help me with that?
Yeah, let me try. I'm not the best person, but I'll see what.
Niloufar Hamidi is second from left. She's a well-known journalist who first revealed the circumstances surrounding Mahsa Amini's death. Hamidi was arrested at her house in Tehran on the 22nd of September of 2022 and placed in solitary confinement. Stadia, women's autonomy, the mandatory veiling law, and the use of aggression by the morality police against civilians and women. Another such case is that of sports journalist Ehsan Pirburnash, who's center of these photos. He was arrested in October of the same year, a month later, for openly supporting and reporting the protest that followed Amini's death via Twitter. So he was arrested and convicted for insulting Islam in a manner that was deemed to be blasphemous, inciting aggression against the Islamic Republic's government, spreading propaganda against the Republic systems, Islamic Republic's system, and I quote. Ehsan Pirburnash was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment. He is out on bail as of February 2023. So there are 95 journalists at last count who were arrested during and in the aftermath of the protest. Iran's law is, of course, one of the more egregious examples. It's one of the more violent examples. It's the country whose bravery in dealing with these affronts and standing up, and women who have stood up to these affronts, is inspiring to us all today. But it is by no means unique. I defended some years ago a man accused of insults or attempts to insult the religion or the religious beliefs of my country. He happened to be well off. He had criminal complaints filed against him all over the country. He was able to find us and engage us. We first went to the Supreme Court to say the law is bad, strike it down. The Supreme Court said, no, we'll send you to the High Court so that and we'll give you leave to approach the High Court. The High Court was hugely overburdened and said, look, this is an important issue, we'll look at it, but we can't give you protection from arrest. There were a number of states in India in which the first information reports or the criminal complaints had been filed. I was most concerned about the state of Haryana. And why is that? Because they had on a previous occasion for blasphemy flown down to Bombay, contrary to their obligations under the Criminal Procedure Code, and effectively kidnapped a comedian and brought him back and arbitrarily detained him. So we had to go to the Sessions Court. And I was particularly worried about this because they have less power. I was worried that they would bow to state influence. And there was one man sitting there, Deepak Gupta, and he gave us interim bail. We joined investigation. I prevented the man from being arrested, even on paper, because that would have been the headline. And this man, Judge Deepak Gupta, he said that there's nothing in it. This does not constitute the law, even as it stands today. And he protected him. But the actual quashing took 4 years. It took 4 years. It took, this wasn't a pro bono case. It cost a bunch of money. It, about 20 trips to the High Court in Punjab. I live in Delhi. And in the end, even though we had given them very detailed written submissions, the judge said that, yes, this isn't an offense under law, but he must give 500,000 rupees to the person that he insulted. So now the Supreme Court is hearing that issue, but at least the case is quashed against him. The way we've approached this report, slide please. The way we've approached this report is we have done primary research on compiling blasphemy laws globally. And the National University Delhi and Nidhi Singh and Sang Rakshita in particular have done the work on this. It was interesting and surprising, this process, because we found, for instance, that Massachusetts and South Carolina and Wyoming, and a couple of other states, also have quite shocking blasphemy laws on the books as we speak. There's an analysis of how and why blasphemy laws fail to meet international free speech standards. In particular, we look at Article 19.3, which is the basis usually for justifying such laws, and Article 20, which should be a limit on how these laws are interpreted. We look at the overlap between blasphemy and hate speech. And I think those of us who have defended a number of these cases believe that it's not a rabbit hole that one should go down and be confused about the fact that blasphemy laws need to go, that it's only when they target individuals and they constitute hate speech. And this should be on a case-by-case basis in court, perhaps through empirical evidence that informs laws, but very, very sharply and well-tailored. How has the implementation of blasphemy laws by states damaged journalism with a focus on the prosecution of journalists? A study on recent reforms by various states to blasphemy laws, and then perhaps the most important part, recommendations for states regarding blasphemy laws. Our findings show that in the Middle East and North Africa, all 22 states studied had at least one form of blasphemy law. Out of all countries studied in Africa, excluding the MENA region, 18 of the 46 states, that's about 40%, have blasphemy laws. In the rest of Asia, 70% of Asian states, 21 out of 30, prohibit blasphemy. 4 of the 22 states in Central and Latin America and 7 out of 11 states in the Caribbean have laws that prohibit blasphemy. Many laws in global North countries, especially in Europe, have repealed their blasphemy laws, while others maintain them, and countries such as Russia have strengthened them. The US Supreme Court has found the blasphemy laws were unconstitutional. However, they remain on the books in Massachusetts, Michigan, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Wyoming. Most countries that limit blasphemy impose criminal laws that allow for prison terms, though a few of these laws, like in Tajikistan, have imposed prison fines. And in Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, they were included in civil and/or administrative legislation. They either have been or have the potential to be jointly applied, though, with criminal offenses. So that's something to keep in mind. At least 4 codified blasphemy laws impose the death penalty for this crime. In the last few years, people have been sentenced to death in countries such as Iran, Nigeria, and Pakistan, to name a few, for blasphemy. So general comment 34 is the opinion that deals with how to look at Article 19 and Article 20. Don't be worried if you're not a lawyer. Essentially, the main part of 19, 1 and 2, right, says that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. It's the freedom of expression part. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include the freedom to seek, receive. That's very important. It's the flip side of the right to speak, is the right to know. And impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of this. His in law means her or their, so his choice. The exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities. And this is the basis on which your and my, and all of those watching, freedom of expression may be limited. It may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as provided by law. And by law usually means legislation. That it can't, like judge-made law, for example, can't limit one's speech. That a notification or a decision by a municipal authority cannot then limit one's speech in this way. It must be necessary. And that's something for the state to establish. It must be necessary, and the restrictions must be sharply tailored to the goals sought to be achieved. For the respect of the rights or reputations of others, for the protection of national security, or of public order, or of public health and morals. These are the various grounds on which a state may justify the existence of a blasphemy law. But remember that it still has to be a law, it still has to be necessary, it still has to be proportionate, and it still has to be sharply tailored to the goal that it seeks to achieve. Article 20, why do we care about Article 20? Law students, lawyers? So Article 20 speaks of hate speech, right? Any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law, not applicable to us. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Now, discrimination or violence are actually acts in the real world, right? So most people wouldn't have problems with those being limited or prohibited in some way. However, the word hostility seems like perhaps too mild a thing to incite, to allow prohibition of in international law. And I think there's wide agreement that it's too broad. There's a way to deal with that, though. General comment number 34 provides a direct and immediate proximity test for all restrictions to speech. The maintenance of public order is frequently cited as a basis for criminalizing blasphemy, but the causal link between the harm and the speech is often the violent conduct by those who disagree with or are insulted by the impugned speech. So this potentially creates incentives for those who are insulted to express their displeasure by engaging in violence, right, with those that they disagree with. And that's referred to as the heckler's veto. So the heckler's veto has caused journalists to suffer detention instead of those threatening unlawful action. Now, let's look at that word hostility. And let's look at it in context of the other provisions of 23. The formulation advocacy of religious hatred that leads to incitement of hostility at its lower threshold is limited by the requirement that, first, only advocacy of hatred is covered. Two, that such advocacy of hatred must constitute incitement, rather than speech causing incitement to hostility alone. If this is confusing, ask me questions when we're done. Third, that such incitement must demonstrably lead to discrimination, hostility, or violence through evidence. Hostility being an intense and irrational set of emotions or opprobrium, enmity and detestation towards the target group. And this is, most of this is based on the work done by Frank LaRue, the former special rapporteur on freedom of expression. So the incitement to hostility has been limited. We found interesting overlaps between hate speech and blasphemy. I think blasphemous hate speech is not addressed adequately across countries of the world. And I think it leads to particular resentment in and by minority communities living in the global north. In a world which is far more globalized and diverse, but where speech is more fluid because of the reach of the internet. Now, the Gillen's Poston cartoons depicting the Prophet, there were 12 of them. And I think the conversation about whether any of those constituted hate speech or not was derailed by the unconscionable and the unconscionable violence that came after. So what is hate speech that's also blasphemous? It's speech that appears to target a religious idea, but in fact targets the followers of a religion. It's not always easy to separate blasphemy from blasphemous hate speech. There are numerous instances of blasphemous hate speech that aren't prosecuted because they appear to be blasphemy per se. In 2005, Gillen's Posten, a Danish newspaper, printed 12 cartoons depicting the Prophet. The headline printed along with these cartoons was so-and-so. Not all of the cartoons, in fact, portrayed the Prophet. One of the cartoons shows the Prophet wearing a turban drawn as a lit bomb. My view is that this cartoon implicates all Muslims. And it's not simply a criticism of a portion of Islamic doctrine. The Danish authorities declined to prosecute anyone in this matter. And in 2007, the controversy around the Gillen's Posten cartoons came back to life when Charlie Hebdo reprinted these controversial cartoons of the Prophet. The Paris Criminal Court's decision cleared Philippe Val, the editor of Charlie Hebdo. The tribunal, while explaining its ruling regarding the drawing of the Prophet wearing a turban with a bomb, said, "The drawing taken on its own could be interpreted as shocking for followers of this religion. However, it had to be seen in the wider context of the magazine examining the issue of fundamentalism. Therefore, even if the cartoon is shocking or hurtful to Muslims, there was no deliberate intention to offend them." All state parties to the ICCPR have a positive obligation as well. Not just an obligation not to interfere and not to have laws, but also a positive obligation to protect individuals against violations of their rights by the state. They have an obligation to protect against acts committed by private individuals and entities, and state inaction can have disastrous consequences. Avijit Roy, the man in the picture, and his wife were attacked by people with machetes in the streets of Dhaka. Although his wife recovered from injuries, Roy died shortly after he was taken to hospital, and his murder is part of a growing trend of violent attacks against bloggers and atheists. Now, this brings us to the recommendations. The first set of recommendations is simply to repeal blasphemy laws, especially those that carry criminal penalties, but in fact, all laws that prohibit blasphemy. The second, speak to limiting the worst harms of blasphemy laws to media freedom. And the third are non-legal interventions. Do you have a slide, please? Blasphemy laws violate international human rights laws. And there was a debate that I think Suzanne was a part of and will perhaps speak to between, but there is now wide agreement that they do violate international human rights law, except when they are narrowly tailored to address advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, unless they constitute hate speech. The death penalty in blasphemy laws and any criminal penalties involving the deprivation of liberty should be repealed immediately. Democratic states that retain blasphemy laws, particularly those of the Media Freedom Coalition, should lead in abolishing these laws, even if such laws have fallen into disuse. Such abolition would remove the threat they still pose to speech, reduce the possibility of revival, and build momentum towards global reform. With regard to safeguards in the law, in Egypt, a court had dismissed charges, in fact, against the leading Egyptian feminist and writer Nawal el-Saadawi for her remarks regarding the origin of the Hajj, a tradition of annual Islamic pilgrimage, and the Sharia inheritance rules by which men can receive double the amount of women. The prosecution didn't go forward as the court dismissed the charges for basic procedural violation and the absence of prior approval to prosecute. Another interesting example of this is, though it has to be looked at carefully because it may lack due process protections, that in December 2014, May Diatama Suryodiningrat, the chief editor of the Jakarta Post, was named as a suspect for religious defamation during a police investigation. The case resulted from a cartoon published in the Jakarta Post, in which a flag similar to that of the Islamic State was replicated with a skull and crossbones and included the phrase, "There is no God but Allah." The cartoon also showed the words, and I quote, "Muhammad and Allah" on the skull. At the time, however, the case was covered by an MOU between the Press Council and the National Police, signed in 2012. So journalists' associations represented to the police that the case was within the authority of the Press Council to deal with, and this led to the case being referred to the Press Council for resolution without any criminal charges being filed. The second set of recommendations detail the steps that can be taken to limit the most prejudicial effects of the law, pending their repeal. The third set of recommendations outlines non-legal interventions by states, including action that supports a rich and diverse media environment and encourages counter speech by religious leaders and other actors. And this is important because as Justice Brandeis has said, and a number of other, and in Shreya Singhal, Rohinton Nariman, a judge in my court in a case that I was in, that fear breeds repression, repression breeds violence. Speech is an outlet that mitigates all of that. Today, there are women, men, others around the world, people who are trying to take science forward. In some cases, they are not believers, they're non-theists. In some cases, they are believers, but they are feminists. In others, they challenge the authority of those who control the hierarchies within religion and the hierarchies between religion. It was time yesterday, it is certainly time today for these laws to go and for us to make sure that there is no hate speech, or that hate speech is limited at the very least by law and by the function of law in all parts of the world. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now you'll all understand why Karuna was invited onto the high-level legal panel, and will recognize the incredible work that's gone into the creation of this report. It's really timely for us to be pressing this because so many journalists around the world are being attacked and are suffering the consequences of speaking truth to power, and also of speaking about the ways in which religion is being used as a way of, in fact, dulling opposition often to governments. So I wanted then to move to a really remarkable woman, Hina Jilani, and I know that Karuna has already made reference to the fact that she has also helped with this report. Hina Jilani is one of the most distinguished lawyers I think any of us can ever meet. She was appointed to the Elders, a leading group of global leaders, which was established by Nelson Mandela. And she is one of those elders who works on global human rights and peace building. She's an extraordinary woman. She's been a lawyer and still practicing in her own country of Pakistan. She's been, she founded the Human Rights Commission there. I can't begin to tell you the list of amazing things that she's done, both nationally and internationally, and for her work in the UN and beyond. Hina, can I ask you to perhaps give us some reflections on this report?
Thank you very much, Helena. First of all, let me thank the university and everybody who's collaborated to organize this launch of Karuna's extremely useful. Apart from being a brilliant report, it's a very useful report, especially for people like me who have spent almost 40 years of their lives defending blasphemy accused. And even when we won certain cases, those victories have not really helped us to improve the environment in which these laws are being applied and to change the mindset of the population in general, the political leadership, and even the judiciary. So I think this report would be of great value, and I intend to present it to our Supreme Court so that they understand what political ramifications, apart from the legal ramifications, that these kind of laws are having. In a country like Pakistan, for instance, where religion has now become the dominant and fundamental basis for determining your life and your lifestyle, it has become really difficult to warn people that anything that you say could be taken as blasphemous by whoever is listening. So in the first place, the blasphemy law in Pakistan misses the essential element of mens rea. So you don't need to intend to say anything. Even if the listener subjectively disagrees with what you're saying about religion, leave alone whether there is any element of insult in it. Even if they disagree, they can easily file a charge of blasphemy against you. And then what follows is what worries us most. Once a charge is made, your life is not worth anything. And we have had people who have been imprisoned as a result of such a charge and killed inside prison. We have people who were actually acquitted, but once they came out of prison, they were hounded and killed. Yeah. Now, in terms of the freedom of expression and journalistic freedom and safety, I would say that in Pakistan, there are fewer journalists than intellectuals, academics, lawyers who have been attacked as a reason for what they have said, but also charged with blasphemy. Now, the problem for the freedom of expression and journalistic freedom is that there is a self-censorship because of the environment which has been created. Right to information is affected because journalists hesitate to even report cases of blasphemy, fearing that even one line or one sentence in that report that can in any way be taken to for anyone in the public reading that to presume or assume that this person is innocent, or that what he has said, which has led to the charge, is not actually insulting for anyone. So even that particular opinion of a journalist in his report could land him into jail. It has not happened very frequently. Bloggers have been prosecuted, of course, but in the print journalism or mainstream electronic media, this is not something that you even discuss or dare to discuss. What has happened in the academic environment is very worrying, because we have had teachers who have tried to explain, and let me say first of all that they've made religious studies compulsory at every level of education. Now, students are really curious. Young people are curious. They may ask a question in a classroom, and this has led to students killing students. This has led to academics landing up in jail. There is one example of a man called Junaid Hafiz, who's a professor. He has been in jail now for the past 10 years now. Oh God. He was convicted, and there's a long wait for him to even appeal his sentence. So these are some of the issues I think that are important for us to understand on the political side as well. It's not just a legalistic question. It is affecting open society values in a way in which the development of religious thought has been effectively obstructed. Lastly, I just want to say that the whole element of violence, in fact, has increased. A lot of people who are in favor of the blasphemy laws tell us that, look, now there is a law. So obviously it prevents people taking the law into their own hands and killing people or harming them. Unfortunately, that has not happened. We have seen mob lynching on the increase on the basis of blasphemy and what is perceived as blasphemy. 2 years ago, or maybe it was last year, a Sri Lankan citizen in Pakistan working in an industrial unit was lynched by the mob and killed, and he was burnt alive. And they used the pretext that he had said something which they deemed to be blasphemous. More recently, a Chinese supervisor of a particular concern was attacked by a mob on the pretext that he had said something about these guys, the workers taking too much time on their prayers during Ramadan. None of the workers understood it, Chinese. And there was nobody around to explain to them anything that the man had said in Chinese. But when he was attacked, he was saved, luckily, because of the prompt action of the police there. But unfortunate fact is that there is now almost total impunity for the perpetrators, because there is a hastiness in arresting people, charging people, investigations are very perfunctory, and then convictions follow. So these are some of the issues I think I felt I should be raising. Although I use Pakistan as an example, because I have more experience of working with these laws in my country, I think it's very important that we understand that these are similar conditions where blasphemy laws are actually being applied in other countries. Just to mention one more fact, blasphemy laws have also increased divisiveness based on religion, on ethnicity, etc. These blasphemy laws have been targeting particularly religious minorities. In my country, for instance, although most of the charges are against Muslims and sometimes based on sectarian issues within the Muslim communities, but also they target non-Muslim religious minorities. And in particular, one particular community in Pakistan, which is the Ahmadiyya community, a particular sect of Islam that was expelled from the Muslim community by an act of parliament, their right to religion, their right to be given all the protections guaranteed for minorities in our constitution really suffers. And there are other countries where similar targeting and discrimination will take place, especially in the application of criminal laws with respect to the profession of religion. Propagation of anybody's religion is totally forbidden except for Islam. So these are some of the things I think we should also think of when we really look at what Karuna has put down in her report. This resonates so much in terms of what the practical issues are arising, how democracy is being eroded through these laws. And I would also say the real spirit of the rule of law is actually destroyed because due process is usually violated. Thank you very much.
As you can see, there's a lot of experience on this panel, and not least the next speaker. It's a great pride to welcome you, Suzanne Nossel, who is the Chief Executive of PEN. I kept hearing when people said we're going to have, this is also involving PEN America. I thought they were saying Pan America and it was some airline that was involved with this. But PEN America, of course, as you know, is a very, very important rights organization and celebrator of the great works of writers, whether they be journalists or novelists or those writing in prose. And PEN is an important element around the world in protecting the rights of journalists. And she is the author of a great book I recommend to you, which is Dare to Speak. She has been involved in most of the leading organizations on human rights. She's held roles at the Human Rights Watch, at Amnesty, and she was in fact appointed to be Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations by President Obama. So I just wanted to say welcome, and it's great to have you here, and especially to hear you on this important subject and on Karuna's report.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I really enjoyed reading this very crisp, clear, easy to digest report, and I commend it to all of you. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand it. It's very well done. For me, it raises a number of issues. You mentioned Salman Rushdie, who is a former president of PEN America. He's very close to our organization. I've worked with him closely for many years and have witnessed how how blasphemy prohibitions can incite and awaken and inflame a hostility that, in his case, I think all of us thought had abated and that he had escaped this. Yeah. And, he has been one of the most present, visible people in our organization, sort of at all the events and all the parties. He founded a big festival here in New York. And so to see what happened last summer, the idea that somebody could be carrying out this decades-old edict and threaten his life to the point where he really very narrowly escaped death is a terrifying reminder that it's not just about a prosecution in a national context. These threats and attacks on speech have a transnational dimension, and we see the long arm of authoritarianism reaching into free societies. Yesterday at the UN, Masih Alinejad, who's Iranian activist in the anti-hijab movement, she lives here in Brooklyn, and she has been the target of an assassination attempt that was exposed, and she lives under constant threat right here in New York City. And she's not the only one. There are other Iranian writers who we work with who live under the same circumstances, and others from other countries, not necessarily because of a version of blasphemy, but it's something people are not necessarily aware of. I think you also make an important point, Hina, that is really very much on my mind as I read this, which is it's an obvious point, and I don't know exactly how to grapple with it, but something we think about it a lot, which is, of course, it's not just about journalists, and it's not even primarily really about journalists. I mean, you talk about Salman Rushdie, talk about Nawaz al-Saadawi, they're writers and journalists and artists who are all kind of caught up in this. And as the panel, I'm curious over time to see how your work evolves and what media freedom really means, and what is encompassed in media. Is it just journalism, or is it wider? We think a lot at PEN about the fact that writers and artists aren't really seen as a category, kind of in international human rights law, and journalists, I think, have done a great job becoming a category that's well recognized by UNESCO, by the Human Rights Council, and that's all to the good. And is that the path we should be trying to follow to get a resolution about the protection of writers or artists? And sort of what is the right approach to sort of get the threats to them recognized and addressed in their totality? So that's something this report kind of raised for me. And the interesting crossover, just the other night we screened as part of World Press Freedom Day 20 Days in Mariupol, this movie made by a Ukrainian journalist from the Associated Press, and that's a piece of journalism that becomes art. Just to touch a little bit on my background with these issues, when I was at the State Department in the Obama administration, there was an international effort to fight back against what was called the defamation of religion, basically another term for blasphemy. And there was a biennial resolution, one every 6 months in Geneva and in New York, condemning the defamation of religion in an effort to get an international treaty that would have banned the defamation of religion. And as the United States, we were very much against this. We work with, the other coalition partners who are behind the, more or less probably the group of countries behind the media coalition that exists today. And, one of the important pieces of that negotiation that was very tricky was that the US has a reservation against Article 20. And so we don't, in America, under US law, accept this idea of incitement to discrimination or incitement to hostility. We recognize only incitement to imminent violence. And it's a narrower category of incitement because we always have the fear that incitement to hostility or discrimination is just too vague, that you could say all kinds of things that might spur someone to discriminate or to evince hostility. And that if you allow that to be prohibited, it's going to risk suppressing too wide a band of speech. And so, we were, had to thread that needle very carefully. The way that we ultimately went about it was to try to steer the conversation toward practical measures that could address interreligious hostility, foster religious coexistence, things like dialogue, and you touch on this in the report, dialogue, interfaith connectivity, responding to hate crimes, prosecuting hate crimes, so populations don't feel like attacks on religion just happen with impunity. And so we essentially put together a set of such measures and began to advocate around the world that instead of trying to condemn the defamation of religion, which was a very divisive agenda we could never subscribe to, that we ought to all get behind sort of these practical measures. And it was at a time when the US had some credibility, I think, on being a country that was concerned about Islamophobia, that was trying to—
A lot has happened.
Yeah, a lot has happened. A lot has happened. This is during Obama. And so we had an envoy fighting against Islamophobia. We had another envoy focused on Muslim communities here in the United States and elevating and amplifying them. And so, we had the ability to fight against the defamation resolution without being accused of being anti-Muslim. And another important piece that came up often in the negotiations when it came to the Europeans was the Islamic countries would say, you ban Holocaust denial, and you ban Holocaust denial in order to protect Jews from discrimination. And so this is just a measure we want to protect us from discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same thing. And it was actually a very powerful argument for us as Americans to be able to say, well, we don't ban Holocaust denial, and that wouldn't be permitted under the First Amendment. And so when we're arguing against this, it's not because we are privileging one religion against another. And so in the end, actually, we finally were able to— I traveled to Islamabad, and we had many convenings here in New York and around the world. And we ultimately got them to back off this biennial resolution to condemn the defamation of religion, to back off the effort to get an international treaty, and to get behind these practical measures that became ultimately the Rabat Plan of Action. And that consensus has sort of shakily held for the ensuing now 13 or 14 years. And I think it does sort of point to some of the ways in which ultimately I hope we can retire these laws, by showing that you're not just taking something away, but you're adding something. There's some proactive effort, affirmative effort to address interreligious tensions and foster respect for religious differences, and that it's not simply about kind of an agenda against Muslims. So
thank you so much. Because you raised something very important, which is that Karuna's report is making it very clear that this isn't sort of an abandonment of protections of people from the vile hostilities and vicious assaults that can take place on a community because they are a religious minority, or to somehow deny the threats that there can be of a serious kind to minority religions. The idea of hate crime is something that can help diminish that and deal with it, as well as incitement offences. Now, I'm going to, our time is limited, as you know, and we're finishing at midday, but I would like some questions if you would like, some of you would like to come in. I mean, I think that the United States always seems to me presents a particular problem on this, because for all kinds of historic reasons, freedom of speech is highly protected here. In a way that is different in Europe, because there's much more balancing between rights in Europe. And so the issue of there's almost, I sometimes say, a fetishizing of freedom of speech in this country, where freedom of speech is fine. Freedom to abuse and absolutely denigrate and reduce the humanity of another is somehow different. And I think that that should be recognized, and we can talk about it. And I have often talked about it with American lawyers. But please, I see your hand up. Come on in.
Thank you so much. Congratulations on this report. My name's Derek Thorne. I'm the head of the Secretariat for the Media Freedom Coalition. So we look forward to promoting this report to our members and featuring it on our various channels. Many congratulations. My question, I was reading the report this morning. I saw among the recommendations there was a point about states engaging with the Diplomatic Networks Initiative. So that is the initiative which tries to promote media freedom through embassies of MFC member countries. We'd be very happy to facilitate that. I just wondered if you could expand a little on what that might involve, and we will get right on it.
Well, let me pile up a few questions so that Karuna or John can answer them towards the end of our allotted time. Who else would like to come in? Anyone else got a question? Good.
Oh, thank you. Really excellent presentation. I'm just wondering, to what extent has or could the campaign itself against blasphemy laws or criticisms of such laws be subject to suppression, has been subject itself to suppression, apart from, statements that might be deemed blasphemous in and of themselves? A second.
Alani, could you hold the mic a bit closer?
I'm sorry.
It was difficult to hear you at the beginning.
Oh,
So
I'm
just say it
sorry.
again,
Thank you. Right. I'm asking to what extent has or might the campaign against blasphemy laws itself or criticisms of blasphemy laws be themselves or has been subject to suppression or to negative actions of the sort that statements deemed blasphemous are subject. Thank you.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Anyone else like to come in? Come on in. Shall I go to John first and then let you do a summation, John? How do we, I mean, here's a particular question about, the high level legal panel is really looking at law. And you, of course, as the secretariat to the Media Freedom Project, are dealing with all the nations that have signed up for this. And there are, I think, 52 nations now, certainly 51.
Yes.
And so the question is, this shouldn't just be putting a name on something. It should mean proactive policy making and legislation to actually protect people, but at the same time to deal with the inhibitions and subscriptions that blasphemy laws create. So, John, what are you going to do? What am I going to do?
What do we roll up my sleeves?
What do we advise to do?
Derek, I'd like to thank you for that public invitation. And of course, when we all go back following World Press Freedom Day, we will sit down, we will talk. So far as the Diplomatic Networks Initiative is concerned, of course, there is a central alignment. One of the remits of the high-level panel is to consider either draft bills or existing legislation and its compatibility with media freedom. Of course, the first recommendation, the primary recommendation, is to get rid of criminal sanction and more generally these sorts of laws. So there is a mechanism through which this can be done. We need to identify states that might be ready. We always need to find the first state that may move and then turn that into a group and then hopefully see that good practice spread across the Media Freedom Coalition in the way that we have seen in relation to some of the advisory enforcement reports. So thank you very much for your invitation. And we're really looking forward to doing that upon the launch of this report.
But we have to recognize that the way that this plays out in many places is where there are, for example, Iran, women demonstrating because they're saying your interpretation of the Quran is not my interpretation of the Quran. And even that is amounting, whether it's in Christianity, where many people, for example, on Roe versus Wade would say your interpretation of when life starts and when, you know, and the value to be attached to, you know, one piece of potential life as distinct from an adult woman. You know, those are debates that should go on without there being the kind of levels of hatred and hostility and incitement that are taking place. But it's about how it plays out is problematic, because sometimes the protection is coming from governments themselves. We want to retain them. So those conversations have to take place. There was that difficult question of yours. Karuna, would you like to answer that one? Which is,
Yes.
you know, are you know, those who are saying this is a defamation of religion itself. Do they, in making that argument themselves, are they themselves contravening some of the things that should be concerning us, in that they are often using language which is insulting and abusive and perhaps even inciting of those who oppose them? I mean, let's imagine it's atheists. Is it causing an incitement towards people who don't share religious belief?
Thank you for that, Helena. Derek, your question's a really good one, and thank you for your engagement. So there is page 47 of the report, speaks directly to this. It says that states could also engage with the MFC Diplomatic Networks Initiative. This initiative allows MFC member states to leverage their networks of diplomatic missions to protect and promote media freedom in the country where they're based. Now, this is the important part. Within the initiative, a single diplomatic network is a group of embassies working together in a specific country. Could be. Activities include issuing statements of concern, undertaking trial observations, hosting events, and conducting trainings. So if in a particular country, because laws for better or for worse are national, we also have recommendations with regard to Interpol. We also must keep in mind the transnational element of not just the speech, but also the violence. But when we speak of dealing with a particular country, a coordinated effort within the country of the embassies can be quite helpful. For example, looking at a particular trial would not only build consensus amongst the people, the participants of the diplomatic network, but also mean that the coordinated pressure that is then brought to bear on the host state, whether it's multilaterally or bilaterally or behind closed doors, which sometimes it has to be, that could work well. Alani, I think your question is actually quite well answered by Helena already. The thing is, and I think this actually also goes to why we are looking at, to Suzanne's point, right? Why are we looking at journalists? And when we address the safety and protection of journalists, we use the word in a very wide sense. The word connotes those who have engaged in journalism, and journalism is defined very widely. I do, and John is looking uncomfortable and wants to say something to that.
We've had a flag at the back of the audience
Yes.
to say end.
Yes.
Now. So and of course, who are we but to obey instructions? But John, do you want to have the final
I was going
word?
to say, I mean, Karuna, I'm actually going to go wider than your definition. The panel has proceeded on a much wider definition of journalists as anyone undertaking journalistic activity.
Yes.
So rather than looking at the label,
Camera people,
looking at what they're doing.
editors, owners of media houses,
Photojournalists, yeah.
photojournalists who are being prosecuted under tax laws, you know? And then the state says that, oh, leave us to our due process and our courts because this isn't about media freedom, right? We look at all of this. I do all sorts of work. I do work in gender, in climate change, I'm very lucky, but
She's
I
one
think
of India's really great lawyers, and that's why she's on this panel. Can you don't have to pay me. You know that's what I feel about you. But I do want to say to everybody that this gathering to discuss the importance of media freedom in our societies is so important. To be here this week and to have the opportunities of coming together to remind ourselves that fundamental to democracy is that pillar of having the right to hear information, to receive information, to exchange information, and to put out information, because that's how decent societies thrive and know what's going on and then know what their rights are and so on. And what we're seeing around the world is a great depletion of this, the murder of journalists and the destruction of media freedom. And when they come for the journalists, the next folk they come for are the lawyers and the judges and the intellectuals and the academics. So we're all in the lineup. So let's all make our
Helena,
voices
can
heard.
I say
Yeah.
a few words in answer to your question about how dangerous it is to campaign against blasphemy laws? If I give you my example, for the past 25 years, I've been under police protection. But that's because I'm a lawyer. Several lawyers have been killed, judges who have acquitted people and written good judgments against the use of blasphemy laws have been killed. So these are some of the things I think we should remember. For instance, blasphemy is so widely construed that the women's rights organizations and child rights organizations who are campaigning against child marriage, there was recently a call by the religious groups to file blasphemy charges against me for making a speech outlawing, demanding the outlawing of child marriage. So these are some of the dangers that we all experience every day. Civil society organizations and actors have had that blasphemy charges against them only for demonstrating against the blasphemy laws.
Hina, you always have something so important to remind us about, that this extends beyond the journalist who writes the piece, the people who are brought before courts. It means that everybody in the lineup ends up being at risk.
I remember a BBC cameraman who was following me when I was coming out of the court after arguing a blasphemy case. And he was almost stabbed by somebody who probably wanted to stab me, but he came in between. So these are some of the dimensions that we can't even sometimes accurately depict, that all kinds of danger lie in your path, whether you are a journalist, a lawyer, an artist, a writer.
Yes. Yeah. So you've had in your presence the most incredible people, and I just want to thank you all for coming, because I know that you're incredible too. Thank you very much. Bye. Well done.